the percentage of the House that was Federalist went from 60% to about, what is that, 33%? Something like that. So the voters had turned on the Federalists decisively because the Federalists tried to take away their rights. When the new Republicans took over the Congress, what do you think many of them now wanted to do to the Federalists?
The same thing.
The same thing, right. Let's get them. They tried to get us. Let's get them. Jefferson tried to make sure that didn't happen. Because Jefferson was convinced if the Republicans retaliated, this would never end. And it would be this way every election. So in his inaugural address, when Jefferson was sworn in, he said, "We are all Republicans." Jefferson would have said, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." What does that mean?
We're all on the same page.
Right. We're all Americans. And this is the beginning of this idea that after an election, we come back together. So that you say nasty things about your opponent the whole time, but then after you lose, you say, "Well, I hope you do well. I want you to succeed because I want our country to do well." And that's the beginning of that tradition. And so Jefferson tried hard to keep those Republicans in Congress from retaliating. Now remember, the Republicans wanted different things from the Federalists. They wanted to shrink the size of the federal government. Because what did they think should have more power? The state governments and the people. So remember that army the Federalists had created? What did Jefferson do with it? Disbanded it. Sent them home. Does that save money? Saves money. Remember the Navy the Federalists had created? Jefferson shrunk it way down. Didn't quite get rid of it, but shrunk it way down. Shrinking the size of the federal government. And if the government wasn't doing as many things, didn't need to collect as many taxes. So what, unpopular to some, tax did they get rid of?
Whiskey.
The whiskey tax. So the Republicans are cutting taxes and shrinking the size of the federal government. So everything we just did here with the election of 1800 is, in a way, the beautiful, inspirational side of America. Because what we had here was a group trying to take away people's rights. And the people then went out and voted, right? They used democratic action. And they kicked those jerks out. That is American freedom. The flip side of that story, through this whole class, is American slavery. It's always the flip side of the story of American freedom. And in the same year that Jefferson was being selected as president, down in Virginia, Gabriel Prosser was organizing a slave rebellion. Prosser was an enslaved blacksmith who lived just outside the city of Richmond. Prosser was inspired by all the revolutions he'd been hearing about his whole life. Which three?
American Revolution, French Revolution.
And the Toussaint Revolution.
Right, and Toussaint's Revolution, which isn't yet called the Haitian Revolution, but will be. So the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the rebellion in the Caribbean. As a blacksmith, Prosser was able to move around a little more freely than most slaves. He was less supervised than most slaves. And he was using that to organize a rebellion. He was stealing metal and secretly making swords in his blacksmith shop and stockpiling them in the woods, preparing for the rebellion. He carefully recruited hundreds of slaves to join his conspiracy. The plan capture the city of Richmond, the capital of Virginia. Capture the city of Richmond, take the governor hostage, and then launch a war. A war to end slavery everywhere in America. Because who's he been inspired by?
Toussaint.
Toussaint, right. So that's the plan, to try to capture the city of Richmond and then launch a war that would end slavery nationwide. On the night of their rebellion, the slaves snuck off their plantations in the pouring rain, all assembling outside the city of Richmond. By the time they got to the edge of Richmond, it was raining so hard that you couldn't see your hand out in front of your face. It was raining harder than anybody living in Virginia had ever seen it rain. It rained so hard, it washed out the bridges leading into Richmond. So they had to abandon the rebellion because of the rain. And then what do they try to do?
Reorganize.
So then you got to get back onto your plantations. And do masters notice hundreds of muddy, soaking wet slaves sneaking back onto the plantations before dawn? Yeah, they notice. So the whole thing unravels the next day. And hundreds of slaves were rounded up for torturing, which the white Virginians called questioning, which is really torturing. They're not going to execute everybody who was involved. Why not?
Need 'em working.
That's right, because that's a valuable piece of property. So in the end, it was Gabriel and about 24 others who were executed. The ringleaders are the ones who get executed.
Where is that sign?
Outside the city of Richmond.
Because I see signs that like exactly like that, like in Columbia, South Carolina, like on campus.
Yeah, these are the historical markers that they use the same kind of style until very recently across all the South.
Yeah. Seems like they would have fared a lot better if they just crossed the river in the rain. You know, like,
They didn't think they could, and you'd have had to swim in the rain. Not all of them knew how to swim.
Why not just hide in the woods until the next night?
Yeah. They didn't know that everything would be unraveled, you know?
And the rain would have worked out for them if they'd gotten into the city. I mean, not a lot of white people
Actually,
were going out.
part of their plan, too, was to set fires in the city of Richmond.
Yeah.
And so it ruined that part of the plan, too. The whole plan was really detailed and elaborate. It was fantastic. I really think it had a good chance if they'd been able to pull it off.
Couldn't predict the forecast.
So Gabriel and about 24 others are executed. Before they executed them, though, Virginia gave them show trials. Not real trials, but a show trial. So that you could officially have the state order them to be executed. But for us, as historians, that means we get to hear the voices of the rebels. Right? Because they got to come into the courtroom and speak. And in the courtroom, Gabriel really compared himself to George Washington. Because he grew up hearing about the American Revolution. And Gabriel said, I have nothing more to offer than George Washington would have had to offer had he been captured by the British and put to trial. Because what would they have done to him? Killed him. So Gabriel says, the only thing I have to offer is my life. He says, I have risked my life to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and I am a willing sacrifice in their cause. So now, by the time he's in the courtroom, what's Gabriel embracing? What does he want to be?
Executed.
martyr.
A martyr. He wants to be a martyr to the cause of freedom. And he got that wish, because Virginia executed him and about 24 other ringleaders. After the rebellion had been crushed, the governor of Virginia, who was a guy named James Monroe, the governor of Virginia, wrote a letter to a friend, and he said, as long as this class of people live among us, we can never count on their tranquil submission. What does that mean?
They'll always revolt.
Right. As long as we own slaves, from time to time they'll try to kill us. You might think that once you'd had that realization, you might say, maybe we shouldn't own other people. But instead, what's the response to Gabriel's rebellion?
Brutality.
Crackdown. Crackdown. Tighter control. Tighter control. Remember the manumissions that had been happening since the Revolution? This helped bring them to an end. It helped bring an end to that era of manumission where masters were freeing their slaves. And instead there were a whole set of state laws designed to crack down on the slave population. So these two things in the same year, the election of Jefferson and the Republicans and Gabriel's rebellion, are two sides of the same American story. American freedom and American slavery. What I mean by that really is that, some people say, hey, my rights are being taken away. I'm going to go vote and stop that. And does it work? It does. And other people are actually owned by human beings and say, I want to go stop this. I should be